Hello and welcome to Chapter 23, Part 2, where we're going to look at the female reproductive system. So we looked at the male reproductive system in Part 1. Female reproductive system, the parts are simple, but the hormonal control is tricky. So when you look at it, the egg starts to develop in the ovary. Let me just get my pen turned on here. So the egg starts to develop in the ovary. Now notice when it starts as a follicle, and then the follicle will develop. Then at ovulation, the egg will leave and become an ovum, and the remainder becomes the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is very important in the production of estrogen, which helps maintain the uterine lining. Okay, so very important because it's kind of a little confusing. And please realize the egg does not cycle around. This is mainly shown this just for simplicity, I guess. So the ovum will leave, and it's not just an egg because there's some extra cells around it. And the ovum is picked up by the fimbriae. The fimbriae are these moving parts of the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube, old terms. Sometimes they're called the oviducts. Uterine tube is what we like to use, or the current term. Now, there is not a direct connection between the ovary and the fimbriae. The fimbriae move around. So here it's possible for that egg to escape and not be picked up by the fimbriae. And then you end up with a pregnancy outside. Well, usually you get an egg outside. Often you don't have pregnancy there. Usually the sperm will meet in the uterine tube, and that's where most fertilization takes place. Then it will go into the uterus and hopefully implant into the uterine lining. When it comes to the delivery of the sperm goes into the vagina. You need to know the cervix. That's a term. Oops, back. The cervix is the opening to the uterus. The vagina is the delivery chamber. Now, there's also, it's called rugae. Again, those are those folds that can contract when space is needed. Okay, so those are the simple location of it. Notice it seems like it's huge, but when you look at it, it's really quite a small area, and it is held together by ligaments, and it's attached to the body wall in the uterus. So as the egg develops, you will have a follicle, and there will be a space created inside the follicle, and the ovum is inside the follicle. Now, ovulation is really kind of tricky in terms of the hormones that are developed in it. We'll look at ovulation. The follicle is stimulated by the follicle stimulating hormone that will cause the follicle to stimulate and grow. Once it's discharged, this is discharged or ovulation occurs by convention. Ovulation occurs on day 14, which is halfway through the cycle. The average menstrual cycle in paper on textbook is 28 days. Day 1 is the first day of menstruation, and day 14 is ovulation. Once the egg leaves, you end up with something called a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will decrease. The corpus luteum secretes estrogen and progesterone, which is used in maintaining the uterine lining, but with time it will decrease. It is signaled chemically to remain active during pregnancy by HCG, human chorionic gonadotrophin, which we'll talk about briefly when we talk about pregnancy. Okay, when you look at the sideways cross section, you'll see that the uterus is here and the bladder is tucked nicely underneath the cervix, or sorry, underneath the uterus. This is why if you ever see a pregnant woman, that kid is sitting right on the bladder. So if she's standing in front of you in the lineup to the bathroom, let her go first. Another concern is quite often when we're talking female sterilization, the fallopian tube is cut, sorry, the uterine tube. Now, if you can think of the fact that how much more difficult it is to get to here, because you have to go through the walls of the body wall. Sorry, the muscle layers in the body wall. Quite often, women will get this done when things are open for a C-section. Okay. In terms of the uterus, the fimbriae will sweep over the oviduct to during ovulation. This picks up, if you look at, no, this one, the unit plan. Here you have one of them, next page. It talks about ovulation. I think it's on the next page. Okay. Here you have an ovarian cycle and you have ovulation. Very interesting, a little more detail than you need to know, but the sperm race will talk about the difficulty or all the different things the sperm has to encounter on the way to finding the female egg. Now, when we look at the external part of the female reproductive system, you don't need, for my purposes or for the purposes of this course, to know all these external words. But in terms of female health, you do need to know these ones because this is where they're talking about them. Please notice when we talked about the male, there was only 2 openings to the outside, and the urine and the sperm came out the urethra. In females, you have 3 different openings. Also, very close together, so this is why sanitation is important. Sanitation, that's the wrong word, but keeping it clean, and you should be wiping from back and then in the middle to the front. You don't want to get any urinary infections. Okay? When it comes to the menstrual cycle is really quite confusing because there are 4 hormones involved and there's 2 areas. There's the ovary and then what happens in the uterus. So when you look at the menstrual cycle, it is controlled by the pituitary hormones. It is cyclic pattern and it's regulated by hormonal feedback. And this is a beautiful example of negative feedback. Okay. First thing to look at is follicle stimulating hormone. This is the first hormone that comes out. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicle to develop. Then, right before ovulation, which is at day 14, you have these peaks, the LH peak and the FSH peak. These are inhibited with birth control. The whole idea of birth control is to prevent these peaks, to prevent the ovulation. Then once the egg ovulates, the egg will go into the uterus, but the corpus luteum remains around. The corpus luteum will then produce estrogen and progesterone. So see how as the corpus luteum occurs, the progesterone levels rise. As the corpus luteum disintegrates, the progesterone level falls. When you have these low levels of estrogen and progesterone, this is when you have menstruation. So as the follicle develops, you have follicle stimulating hormone. It will start the development of the follicle, which will produce estrogen. This estrogen spike will cause the LH spike. So there we have feedback. Then as the egg develops, the estrogen, you can tell estrogen because there's 2 bumps, progesterone 1 bump. The estrogen starts preparing the uterine lining, and this is uterine lining. Realize this is magnified a huge amount. The uterine lining only grows thickens a couple of millimeters. And it has to do with having this lining prepared so that it'll be ready for implantation and the development of the placenta. Estrogen starts the thickening of the uterine lining, but it's progesterone that maintains the thickening of the lining. Once progesterone drops and estrogen drops, the uterine lining is no longer maintained and it will be shed, and then you have menstruation. So normally menstruation is day 1 to 5, ovulation is day 14. Notice here that we have day 28, so day 28 and day 0 are actually the same and considered the same time. Okay, quite complicated in the way it's going. So when you look at it, beginning of cycle, you have follicle stimulating hormone stimulating several follicles to develop. When follicle stimulating hormone develops the follicles will produce estrogen. The production of estrogen thickens the endometrium. And because of that, it will inhibit follicle stimulating hormone, but releases luteinizing hormone. This spike in luteinizing hormone is what causes ovulation. So, where'd it go? The estrogen, so first off, the follicle stimulating hormone comes to pituitary. Follicle stimulating hormone will stimulate the follicle. As the follicle develops, it releases estrogen. Estrogen negatively feedbacks on follicle stimulating hormone, but stimulates luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone spikes, and you have ovulation. Okay? Ovulation. Very important. Then, after ovulation occurs by this LH surge. Then the ruptured follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and it's the corpus luteum which produces progesterone, and progesterone causes the endometrium to thicken. Then progesterone and estrogen will feed back to the anterior pituitary. And as a result, that negative feedback to the anterior pituitary will then say, don't release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. So the presence of estrogen and progesterone inhibit luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. That's why most birth control contains estrogen and progesterone. The idea is to keep an even level of estrogen and progesterone to prevent this follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from being released, so therefore you don't have ovulation. No ovulation, you can't get pregnant. No ovulation, no egg, you can't get pregnant. I will still have some more to talk about in terms of the menstrual cycle or what's going on in the uterus, but I will continue that on the next video because I'm running out of time.